So far in our studies of cellular biology, we've looked very much at the big picture or the generic picture at what, for example, animal cells might be like structurally. But what I'd like to introduce you to straight away is the idea here that if we look at the very specific structure, of a cell, and in this tutorial in the case of animal cells, we can learn a great deal about the function of a cell. So just to put that in really simple terms, what we mean by that is if we take a close look at what the cell looks like, what it contains, the features that it has, we can pretty much figure out what its job is, its function is. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to the notion of differentiation. And this is the idea that many, in fact, the vast majority of what we'd call mature animal cells, they differentiate to take on specific roles within the body, within a tissue, and so on. So we're interested in this process and what the output of this process happens to be. So a real neat key term for you to use. So without further ado, let's have a look at a sperm cell. Now, I don't think anything's going to shock you here at the start, because the sperm cell has a nucleus, and it happens to be that in our specialized differentiated sperm cell, we have the nucleus, which is in the head. Okay, that seems to make some kind of logic. But what about if I was to tell you that this nucleus only has 23 chromosomes? And as we may or may not know at this point, in order to code for a human being, we need 46 chromosomes. And that, of course, is interesting because sooner or later, and this is kind of part over here of an ovum. Imagine this ovum is carrying on to make an egg structure over here. But sooner or later, of course, this sperm cell may actually fuse with this ovum. And this ovum also has 23 chromosomes. So we see a specialization straight away in the sperm cell in that it only carries half of the genetic information. Secondly, we have almost a packet or a bundle here of enzymes. And these enzymes at the very top of the head, these enzymes, their job is to digest through the ovum, let me just go down slightly, digest through the ovum. Okay, so let's imagine that this sperm cell fuses with this egg. These enzymes can effectively digest the wall of the ovum and break the membrane of the ovum, and effectively can go on to fuse these two cells together, fertilization to take place, and a zygote to be produced. Now, I also want to introduce you to this part of our sperm cell. Within here, and we see them kind of striped in red here, we have a whole series of tried to write it wrongly there, mitochondria. And of course, as we've seen before, mitochondria are the main site of aerobic respiration. Sometimes we call them the aerobic factories of different types of cells. And as a result, if we think about the active life cycle that this sperm cell has, it makes perfect sense that this cell would be packed with mitochondria in order to release that energy for movement, in this case, a form of swimming. A couple of other points. It's fairly obvious to say that our cell here, it has a tail. So there's our tail. Be aware that a lovely term that you can use is that it has a flagellum. And we did look briefly at that term when we looked at bacterial cells and eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, but this tail we can refer to it as a flagellum. And of course, we're saying here that this enables movement, in this case, a form of swimming. It enables movement. And finally, for this sperm cell, just looking at the big picture of our sperm cells, I suppose really, is we should recognize that it is a streamlined shape. And that, in terms of the efficiency of movement and the long journey that it has to follow, the structure of this cell, the structure of this cell makes perfect sense with relation to what this cell has to do. Okay, lovely. Let's move on. Let's look at a different type of specialized animal cell. And in this case, we actually have what we're going to refer to as a nerve cell, or what we can also call a neuron. A neuron. And with the cold that I've got today, the way I say neuron is kind of coming out a little bit funnily. Now, before we go on, I'm going to actually do something I don't normally do. I'm going to select a part of our cell, this bit, and I'm going to make a copy of it, and I'm going to bring it over here. So, oh, actually, I just realized I made a mistake. Bear with me a second. I shall try that again. So let's do that again. Let's select a part of our neuron. I'm going to select this part. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it. And I'm going to bring it over here for safekeeping. I'm going to show you what we're going to do with that a bit later on. So just bear with me. I'll show you where that's going to come into play in a few moments' time. So a couple of features of our neuron, first of all. Well, the first one I want to draw your attention to is right here, and it's what we call the axon. The axon. And you see the axon here, it's the wire-like structure, which, as I'm sure you realize, is how the electrical impulse is carried by the cell. Secondly, we have these structures here, and here, and here. This is what we would call myelin. And myelin's an interesting structure because it allows this cell to be insulated, or it insulates, and perhaps really importantly, it speeds up, or it helps to speed up nerve transmission. So the actual speed at which the nerve impulse can actually travel is assisted by the presence of this myelin, which effectively coats the axon and insulates it. A couple of other features, not going to be too surprised here to show that we have here a nucleus. We have here a nucleus, and down at this end here we have numerous examples. Let me just change colour. Let me go for a little light red colour. Here we have numerous examples of what we'd call a synapse. A synapse. And synapses, again, are interesting structures because effectively they act as junctions. Now, this is where my kind of extracted image becomes useful to us here, because what I'm going to do is, you have to remember that these junctions, you could effectively have the end of one neuron effectively connecting with the end of another, and that's why we find these synapses here to be structured how they are. So one of the things I'd say to you here is that the impulses pass from one nerve cell or one neuron to another. Okay, and you can kind of see, even though I didn't quite get my layers right here, you can kind of see how the ends of this one may end up effectively forming junctions here with the dendrites, which I'm going to come to now, on the end of this cell. And finally, these points here, 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 these are what we'd refer to as dendrites. And it's not going to surprise you, I don't think, because it's a concept we've looked at with a couple of different things already, is that this increases, these dendrites, they increase the surface area. They increase the surface area. Okay, they increase the surface area of the cell. And as we've seen already, they connect, and they also connect to other cells. Okay, so nothing too shocking there. But again, if I just come back to our basic premise, the structure of the cell informing what the cell does. And that feels good. Let's move on to our final example, and it's that of muscle cells. Excuse me. Now, I guess the key thing we want to realize about muscle cells is they kind of contract and relax, contract and relax, contract and relax. And we've actually got numerous different types of muscle cells within, for example, the human body. We won't get into the specifics of that just now, but really what I want to sort of address with the muscle cell is that they contain proteins. And those proteins, as we've just seen with my rather humble demonstration, contain proteins and what they do is they change the length of muscle. Okay? Now, if you think about the role of muscle, whether it's a muscle in your thigh or whether it's a muscle in the heart, for example, or a muscle that surrounds the digestive organs, for example, those muscles have to contract or sometimes constrict. They have to contract and then relax, contract and relax. And that is achieved by the protein structures within them. Secondly, they have lots of mitochondria. Again, I don't think that's going to be too surprising to you when you think that the dominant job of muscle fibers is to produce force. And in order to produce force, we have to release energy, and the main site of aerobic respiration are the mitochondria. So nothing too shocking about that. And finally, muscle cells group together to form muscle tissue. And there's lots of examples. We could be talking about the heart muscle, for example. So we have these structures. Now, to finish off with, as we always do, I want to look at some key language that we've covered here. A sperm cell we have looked at. We've looked at the tail-like structure of the flagellum of the sperm cell. We've talked about the chromosome, which codes for, or is effectively the genetic makeup, 23 chromosomes within a sperm cell, for example. We've looked at a neuron or a nerve cell. We've looked at a dendrite. And with regard to dendrites, we're talking about increasing surface area and connecting to other neurons. We've looked at the wire-like axon of that nerve cell, the synapse, which is the junction between one nerve cell and another. We've looked at myelin, which is it's the insulating and increasing the speed of nerve transition structure around the axon. And we've looked at proteins, particularly those proteins within the muscle cell, which help to cause contraction and allow for relaxation.